The lost empire of Tartaria is the most delightful conspiracy theory. It posits that a technologically advanced civilization spanned Eurasia and perhaps parts of North America until as recently as a century ago, when it was erased from history. What's left of Tartaria are ornate and seemingly out-of-place structures, from opulent churches in Russia to the Shanghai Bund. The theory stems from disappointment in modern architecture. We once had fabulous Art Deco skyscrapers, Beaux-Arts train stations, and Second Empire post offices. Now everything is a glass and concrete box. What happened? The theory is that Americans and Europeans didn't build those monuments. They are the legacy of a Tartarian empire that emanated out of Northeast Asia. Are we supposed to believe that 18th century mapmakers drew a vast Tartaria in that region out of ignorance? Surely not. Tartaria was real, and it was the most powerful empire of its time. The Great Wall of China was built not by the Chinese to keep the barbarians out, but by the Tartarians to keep out the Chinese. Opinions are divided about the empire's demise. Some believe a biblical-sized mudflood decimated Tartaria, which also explains why so many old buildings have what we now call semi-basements. Adherent of this theory, suspect monuments like St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square continue tens or even hundreds of meters underground. Others suspect World War II was really a war of all against Tartaria, and the destruction of Old Berlin, Dresden, Warsaw, and other cities in Central and Eastern Europe was a deliberate effort to wipe away the traces of a rival civilization. Now let's check if all this is true. Indeed, there are European maps of the 16th, early 19th centuries, which includes Tartary. Let's look at them in more detail. Here is a map from the Atlas of 1570, Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, by the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius, which clearly shows a huge Tartary from the Urals to Japan. A logical question arises: where did the cartographer get the information for his map? Let's start with the fact that Europeans began to talk and write about Tartary from the middle of the 13th century. Just then, the Tatar Mongols appeared in Europe, who defeated Kievan Rus and reached Poland and Hungary. These lands of Central Asia were settled by Turkic-speaking peoples from ancient times, such as Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turkmens, and Tatars. The name of Tartary came from the name of the Tatars people. They settled a common territory from the Crimea to China. They participated in the Mongol conquests in Europe and played an important role in state building. Thus, Europeans could call this entire territory from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean Tartary. Even the name of the terrifying people very successfully supplemented with the name of the infernal abyss from Greek mythology, and the country of Tartary appeared. Over time, the descendants of Genghis Khan formed their own states, indeed from the Volga to Korea, but it was precisely a conglomerate of independent states, which were quite well known to European politicians, in particular in the second half of the 15th century, when the Ottomans seized Constantinople and a new frightening force appeared in Europe. The popes tried to form an alliance with the Golden Horde against the Turks, but nothing came of it. Thus, by the 16th century in Europe, it was well known that there was a Tatar state behind the Moscow Principality, but they did not have accurate information about it. A few travelers in those years went there, and trade with China went along the Great Silk Road through completely different lands located to the south, through the southern part of modern Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and further to Persia. So the knowledge of Europeans about Tartary can be summarized as follows. The state of the Tatars begins behind the Moscow Principality, but no one knows where it ends. Then, the era of great geographical discoveries began. Europe learned about the existence of North and South America, the Malay Archipelago, Japan. Maps and entire atlases of the world began to appear. But the inner part of Eurasia was still terra incognita for Europeans. In the 1550s, the Tatar states on the border of Europe and Asia, the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates, disappeared from the political map of the world. Ivan the Terrible annexed them to the Russian kingdom. But just after that, maps with Tartary began to appear. Why is that? because the Europeans simply did not pay attention to the events of 1552 to 1556, busy with more important events. Indeed, in 1555, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V abdicated the throne, perhaps the most influential politician of the first half of the 16th century, who owned a significant part of Europe, Germany, Czech Republic, Spain, a significant part of Italy, and in the rest of the world his possessions stretched from Peru to the Philippines, and his heirs began to divide a huge empire. At the same time, exhausted France and the Habsburgs concluded a peace that put an end to the series of wars between the Valois and Habsburg dynasties that had lasted since 1494, with the participation of various allies from England to Turkey. In England, the official religion managed to change twice in one decade, and both shifts were accompanied by large-scale repressions among the nobility. The king was also replaced in France, where a civil war on religious grounds was already brewing. In short, Europeans had a lot to do in those years, and the question of who would get the huge inheritance of Charles V concerned them much more than the fate of the Kazan or Astrakhan Khanate, the very existence of which most even educated Europeans did not even suspect. However, complete atlases of the world appeared, and it was necessary to fill the space between the relatively well-known Russia, China, and Japan with something. Over time, much more information about those regions began to arrive in Europe, and Tartary from a huge state was reduced on maps to a purely geographical concept. The map of 1806 by the British cartographer John Carey shows Chinese Tartary, that is the northern part of the Qing Empire inhabited by Turkic nomads. However, the author also included Tibet and independent Tartary, that is Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand Khanates in Central Asia, and to the north is Russia, from Perm to Kamchatka. Another cult object of the adherents of the Great Tartary is the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1773, where there is an article about the Great Tartary. However, there are subtleties here too. In that very article, the term country is used, which means not only state, but also locality, territory. And indeed, the article only briefly tells only about the location of the Great Tartary, but not a word about its cities, or at least the capital, as was done in the same encyclopedia in the article about Russia. In addition, the adherents of the existence of the Great Tartary for some reason cite only an article from the very first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, while bypassing all subsequent ones with thunderous silence. It would seem that question is closed, and the Great Tartary should go into the archive together with the country of El Dorado and the state of Prester John. But no, in our time this anachronism was extracted from oblivion and began to be intensively promoted with stories about the existence of a huge independent state even in the 18th century, information about which malicious elites deliberately withdrew from their archives, but thanks to some European maps, they did not let the whole state sink into oblivion. Now let's try to establish how it all started these days. The fictional empire of Tartary originates in the pseudo-intellectual, historical revisionist theories of Alexander Kinyevich and Anatoly Fomenko. Alexander Kinyevich was a cult leader of the revival of neo-paganism. Anatoly Fomenko is the inventor of the new chronology and the main intellectual force behind the conspiracy theories about Tartary and the denial of the Mongol yoke. They claim that Tartary was an ancient Russian empire that ruled the world and was the center of civilizations. Slavic neo-pagan nationalists invented a fictional empire that never existed, called Tartary, based on some maps of the 18th century. There are several reasons why they invented the fictional formation Tartary. They cannot accept the perceived humiliation due to the fact that the Slavs, in particular Russia, have been under the rule of the Turco-Mongol Tatars for 300 years. They want to invent a fantasy in which the Slavs, or more precisely, the Russians, are invincible. They were also puzzled by the racial hygiene and cannot accept the idea that the Mongols interbred with Slavic peoples. They wanted to create a fantasy in which they had an ancient Aryan empire that ruled everyone else, and that the Slavs/Aryans are the most ancient people, and all the world wisdom/esotericism comes from the Slavs, Aryans. So their theory is deeply rooted in Aryan superiority. I'm sure this ideology is familiar to everyone, so just remember, every time you talk to a supporter of the Great Tartary or a denier of the Mongol Empire, their faith is rooted in Aryan superiority, which is essentially Nazism and fascism.